Hi there, I'm Dr. Scott Midson and I'm lecturer in liberal arts at the University of Manchester. I'm here today to tell you a bit about my research, which is on religion and robots. Although it doesn't seem like robots and religion go together, they actually have a deep history, as I show in my research. I've developed this research while at the University of Manchester, where I've been based in some form since 2007. I actually came as a student doing my undergrad in that year, and then I stayed on for my master's, PhD, postdoc, and now my lecturing job. So you could say I'm quite biased about how great the city and the university is for conducting research that kind of pushes boundaries in interesting directions. Before going into how religion links to robots, it's quite helpful to start with some key definitions. Now, although robot is a word that we come across quite a lot in sci-fi, for example, but also increasingly in our everyday lives, we're ever more familiar with robots on the news when they're coming out into our nursing homes, into our hospitals, and even our own homes. Even though we sort of are a lot more familiar with this term robot, what does it actually mean? The term robot comes to us from a 1920 play written by a man called Karel Čapek. The play is called RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots. Now, Karel Čapek was a Czech writer, and the word robot comes from the Czech, which translates as sort of slave or worker. It has connotations with labour in some way, basically. And in this play, we have the first kind of main narrative of robots in particular rebelling against their human creators. They were created to work in factories and they rebelled and overthrew the humans. These robots were seen as lacking souls and being only sort of workers. And this links to other prominent sci-fi movies that feature robots of the time, things like Fritz Lang's 1927 film Metropolis, which features the idea of the machine man. Robot, for a lot of people, suggests things like machine, and indeed a lot of robots are machines. Surprisingly though, the first robots in Karel Čapek's play were more like kind of biological clones rather than robots. It was how they performed that made them robotic. It wasn't their machineness. Also, a lot of robots that we have look like humans, and indeed being human-like is a typical characteristic of robots, but it's not always the case. We have a lot of robots that resemble different animals, things like Miro the robot, which is designed to be like a kind of pet, like a dog or a rabbit or even a cow. And actually, the robots that do specifically look human-like we call anthropomorphic or humanoid. So it's a subset of robots. Anthropomorphic robots are really complex to understand, particularly in terms of how we think about human-robot relationships. And this image is one of the things that we tend to find with explanations and discussions of anthropomorphic robots. Do you know what this arrow is pointing to on this image? Well done if you said uncanny valley. Uncanny valley is a sort of fairly well-known idea in robotics, and particularly in human-robot interactions. And it's the idea that if we get robots that look like humans, the more human-like they look, the more familiar and the more comfortable we are with them. This is the sort of trend expressed by the upward-facing slant, the upward gradient. And then we get to this point with Uncanny Valley where we get robots that look so human-like, but they're not quite right. They have slightly different movements, they have slightly uncanny features, they look almost like they're dead, but they're living at the same time. And this really unsettles us, and it makes our comfortability, our familiarity, plummet right down into this notion of Uncanny Valley. Now, the final part of this slope on the far right of the diagram is purely hypothetical. It's the idea that if you carry on making robots that are increasingly human-like, we'll eventually push past Uncanny Valley and get to the point where we have robots that are so indistinct from humans that actually our comfort levels go right back up with them, because it's almost like, or it is for all rights and purposes, like interacting with a human. This is something that's quite hypothetical. It's something we have not had founded or proved. It's something we only really find in sci-fi. So movies like Blade Runner, for example, have robots that are so indistinct from humans that you have to have what's called a Voight-Kampff test to distinguish robots from humans based on their ability to have empathy and to show certain emotions. Similarly, in Humans, the Channel 4 AMC TV series, we also have, again, robots, synths that look so much like humans, but they have eerie, kind of uncanny movements that give them away. And it's this question of uncanny valley here. Can we get through this valley to the other side? One man who's optimistic that we can get through to the other side is Japanese roboticist Hiroshi Ishiguro. He famously makes a lot of robots that look like himself and other people with the aim of breaking through uncanny valley. I'll leave it to you to decide if he's successful or not. All of these questions about uncanny valley and how we develop robots raise the matter of how much competence and capability we have when it comes to designing new technology. And this is where Moore's law steps in. Moore's law proposes that over time we will have increasingly rapid and increasingly advanced technological developments in an increasingly short space of time. So according to Moore's law then, we might actually see within perhaps even our lifetime, and this is what people like Ray Kurzweil, who's a famous technologist who adheres to Moore's law, these kind of people think that even within our lifetime we'll have what's called strong AI, the notion that robots will have human-like abilities in thought and processing power. Other people are more skeptical about this, but it's an interesting theory that we can certainly look at, especially when it comes to thinking about the matter of what it is to be human in the first place. The question about what it is to be human is a really, really important one, and it's one that we face quite often in our lives, perhaps even without realizing it sometimes, particularly in sci-fi and when it comes to robotics, as we've seen with Uncanny Valley and Moore's law. We have different ideas about what it is to be human that actually are somehow expressed and also challenged by these new technologies. So with Uncanny Valley, for example, we have the idea that robots are designed and built to look like humans in some way, to look like specific people even, and at the same time, these robots are similar to us, but also very different from us. We don't know if we even want to get to the point beyond Uncanny Valley where robots are indistinct from humans. And this is an interesting point because actually in our religious and mythical traditions that talk to us a lot about ideas of what it is to be human in the first place, we have these ideas of human uniqueness. And actually understanding these kind of ideas about human uniqueness, particularly from these theological and religious traditions, can help us to make sense of some of our anxieties that we have about robots and what it is to be human in our current context as well. An important theological notion that comes up here is this of Imago Dei. What does it mean? So Imago Dei literally translates as the image of God, and we find it particularly in Genesis chapter 1, where we have the story of not only the creation of the world, which is cosmogenesis, and this word can be broken down into two Greek parts. So cosmo links to cosmos for world, and Genesis is the kind of beginnings or the starts of something. As well as cosmogenesis in Genesis 1, we also have the story of anthropogenesis. Anthropos is the Greek term for the human, so anthropology, for example, is the study of humans, and anthropogenesis is the study of the story of the creation of the human. Now, Genesis 1:27 explicitly says that humans are made in God's image, and this is something that a lot of theologians have had a lot of conversations about what it actually means. Does it mean something like our rationality and our reason and our ability to use language, for example? Things that actually, linking it back to robotics, we're now making our robots to sort of start to do as well. So is there a connection then between the Imago Dei and what our robots are doing in our own image as humans? Is Imago Dei, though, perhaps something different about our humanness? Is it about our ability to connect with other people, our ability to socialize, to learn as we experience the world? And these are things that actually robots are surprisingly starting to do, but on a very different scale to what humans are doing as well. So this question about the continuity between God, humans, and robots through this question of Imago Dei is an interesting way that we can both ask what it means to be human, but also what it means to think about humanists in the context of robots as well, from these mythological traditions. And there are also other mythological traditions that we can bring into the study of robots. Do you know, for example, what a golem is? Golems have their roots in Jewish thought, where they are moulded shapes of clay that are mystically brought to life by the word of God. These golems then were put to work protecting communities, often from Christian attackers, and they would be deactivated by removing the inscription that bared the word of God from their head or mouth. In one story, though, that is associated with Rabbi Lowe of Prague, the word of God was not removed from the golem on the day of the Sabbath, which was supposed to, in accordance with Jewish tradition, be a holy day of rest. The golem then rubbed the part of the inscription that it carried, making it read that God was dead, and it caused chaos and destruction in the community, and it took much restraint in order to get it back into control. And the moral of the story? Well, we're told that everything must be ordered to God and his created orders and structures. This is interesting in the context of humanness and thinking about what it is to be human. The first created man, Adam, who we meet in Genesis 2, can also be considered a golem. According to Genesis 2, a shapeless mound of clay was animated by the divine breath of life. It's also interesting in the context of robots. To whom can we say that they are ordered? And to what extent can we say that they're ordered to God? Interestingly, even though we're in a more secularized world, these theological motifs of humanness and creation seem to inform our concerns about robots going out of control, which have deeply theological roots. In many ways, then, stories of robot apocalypse, as we find in sci-fi such as The Terminator, The Matrix, and its prequel The Animatrix that introduces the human-robot conflict, we find that all of these stories are expressions of anxieties about the status, power, and role of the human. Religious teachings and mythologies underpin all of these questions, and we keep returning to them in our ambitious yet tentative techno-culture. Mary Shelley's classic and infamous text Frankenstein provides another key example of this. The novel explores the moral dilemmas of science and creation, specifically unnatural creation, where the male scientist seeks to create new life. What is unnatural here is the absence of the female partner, a transgression against Genesis 1 and 2, as well as the animation of new life, akin to the golem myths, but without God. To reach beyond what is appropriately or naturally human is something that religious mythologies frequently deal with via narratives of hubris, and they parallel concerns about new technologies, often termed playing God. Dr. Frankenstein, Mary Shelley suggests, is guilty of hubris. The subtitle of the novel makes this particularly clear. Prometheus, Babel, Icarus, and golems are all mythological examples of hubris, i.e. humans trying to go beyond themselves and almost kind of playing God, stepping over beyond what the adequate human limits are accepted as. Prometheus is a Greek mythological figure. He is a sort of demigod who stole the fire from the gods, gave it to humans, and this is part of our kind of technological capacity that we now have. Zeus was not happy with what Prometheus did, and Prometheus's punishment was to be chained to the side of a mountain where an eagle would peck out his liver and then it would regrow because he's an immortal god, and then he'd endure the same punishment over and over again. So Prometheus, we can see, was punished for his hubris. Also with Babel, the tower that was trying to reach to the heavens, this was another example of humans literally trying to overreach themselves and transcend themselves. God, in the Genesis narrative, was not happy about this, and he brought the tower crashing down and separated everyone into different languages so that this kind of thing couldn't happen again. Again, another example of hubris. Similarly with Icarus, it's another Greek mythology where Icarus had his wings made of wax and feather. Icarus got a bit carried away with enjoying the sort of flying experience, and he flew too close to the sun. And the consequence was that his wings, his wax wings, melted and he came crashing down to the earth. Literally, he overreached himself and he had the punishment for his action there. And also we see with the golem, forgetting to keep the golem ordered to God on the sacred Sabbath day, that's another kind of example of hubris as well. So humans, we find in these traditions, have clear limits, and to overreach those limits is problematic. And we see this particularly clear in a lot of our notions about robots, but also coming from Mary Shelley's classic story of hubris. That, of course, doesn't stop us from being fascinated with robots, and in our contemporary world, we find robots increasingly present, while we continue to grapple with these questions about how they reflect us and how they will impact us and what we think it means to be human. Are we unique amidst our technologies? Do robots image God in any way? Do they help or hinder us to image God ourselves? Whether in secular or religious contexts, these theological questions have wide-reaching consequences and, as my work shows, they need to be taken into account alongside ideas from social science, psychology, law, and of course, robotics. Although a lot of this discussion about mythology and sci-fi and all these big narratives and fears, although they seem that they're very disconnected from the world, they're really not. A lot of these robots are here with us now, and we need to think about these kind of questions. They're already raising and problematizing the questions of how we think about humanness. Now have a look at these 4 images. All of them are robots. Can you tell which one's the odd one out? First off, we have the Iron Giant, who is the star of the 1999 Disney movie where a boy befriends an alien that looks like a robot. Next up, we have Sophia the robot, who was activated in 2016 on Valentine's Day. Sophia was made by Hanson Robotics. Then we have Ava, who is one of the main characters in Ex Machina, a film directed and written by Alex Garland and released in 2016. And then finally we have Baymax, who is one of the main characters of Big Hero 6, Disney's 2014 film. All 4 of these robots raise questions about humanness in different ways. Are they protagonists or antagonists? Are they helpful or harmful? They all raise these questions in helpful ways. The odd one out, though, is Sophia. Sophia is the one out of the 4 of these robots that is actually real. That is, Sophia has been manufactured by Hanson Robotics. Not only that, but Sophia has actually got personhood status in Saudi Arabia. So when it comes to thinking about human and robot rights and the allocation of personhood status and whether robots are just tools or anything more than that, Sophia is a really interesting way of raising these questions. Not only these, but Sophia is designed to look like a woman. She's designed to also be transparent in a sense and be a robot, which raises issues about gender and technology as well. Now, these are just some of the ways that religion links to robots. You can also explore things like apocalypse and eschatology and how details of the robot end times, the sort of thing that we touched on with The Matrix and the Animatrix, how these tap into bigger religious narratives of revelation and apocalypse, and robots again take on a kind of a godly kind of judgmental role as much as humans themselves are the ones playing God. Here we can also link in the non-theological ideas of Ray Kurzweil, who is a technologist that talks about the idea of spiritual machines, machines that somehow become spiritual because they've got to such a point of artificial intelligence where it becomes relevant to talk about their consciousness and their beliefs. Kurzweil links this as well to the idea of the singularity. Now, the singularity is supposedly the moment in the future where machines and the universe will become conscious. If this is going to happen at some point, then we can link it to theological ideas as well. In my own research at the moment, I'm looking at love as a way of thinking about human-robot relationships. What is the role of love in human friendships, human relationships, and human communities? And can robots tap into that in any way? So we have a lot of references in Christianity, for example, to neighborliness. Can a robot tap into that in any way? These are just some of the ways that robots link to religion, and I hope to have demonstrated some of these points to you here in this brief presentation. How we think about humanness, and this is something that we think about even if not at the forefront of our minds, it's something that crops up as an assumption in so many things that we do in the world, so many of the films and narratives that we watch. all of these ideas have a theological underpinning, and actually understanding the mythology and the theology of these ideas can help us to understand our situation and our attitudes to robots and to ourselves a lot more in this important time. Thank you very much for listening.